Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex source material, unpack it, and lay out the core ideas for you. Today, we are really diving deep into the cosmic horror world of the Magnus Archives, or TMA. It's this, amazing fiction anthology podcast that did something really unique. It took cosmic horror, usually about the unknowable, and made it terrifyingly specific.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's such a brilliant setup. We're not just looking at, creepy stories recorded on tape. We're analyzing this incredibly detailed, chilling system the show built, this whole taxonomy of terror, these godlike entities that literally feed on human fear.
Exactly. And that's our mission today, to get under the hood of this universe, understand how these entities work, and maybe figure out what this giant map of dread tells us about our own modern anxieties. We have to start at the Magnus Institute itself, right? The organization that's all about researching the weird stuff, led by Jonathan Sims, the head archivist. And fundamentally, it's dedicated to the eye, the beholding.
Right. And that institute framework, that's where the show's central paradox really lives and breathes. Traditional cosmic horror, your Lovecrafts and stuff, it relies on the terror of the unknowable. The idea that our minds just can't handle the reality of these massive alien things. But TMA, it flips that script entirely. Our sources show the horror isn't that we can't understand the monster. The horror is that we absolutely can.
It spells it all out for you. The nature of these entities, who works for them, their history, how they operate, everything. But knowing the rules of the game doesn't actually help you escape.
Exactly. The fear just shifts. The horror becomes about the meticulous certainty of the mechanism. Like, the world is governed by these 14, maybe 15 forces. That's a given. But then there's this radical uncertainty about what happens to the specific people caught in the gears. And, maybe more importantly, what it means for you, the listener. It pulls the dread away from just being theoretical and makes it feel, inevitable.
Okay, inevitability. Let's unpack that. We need to start at the beginning, the genesis of fear itself. Where did this whole pantheon come from? It must be older than the Institute, older than this guy Smirk we'll talk about, older even than, language.
Oh, absolutely. The sources point to a really deep history here. The entities basically spring from proto-fear, just raw, undiluted dread that kind of evolved alongside life itself. We're talking primal terrors, the stuff that crawled into the earliest nervous systems. It's this fundamental energy. And as humans developed consciousness, memory, societies, that primal horror started to fracture, adapt, specialize. It picked up language triggers, societal anxieties, refined its methods.
And naturally, as soon as humans got complex enough, they tried to slap some labels on it, try to categorize it. Which brings us to Robert Smirk, the English architect whose work kind of became the Institute's foundational text on this stuff.
Smirky's classification is, it's crucial. He tried to map these huge, shapeless forces into 14 distinct entities. Smirk's 14, as they call it. And he wasn't just doing this in theory. He was working during the Industrial Revolution, a time when, as the show puts it, humanity started to mass-produce its nightmares. Think about it. Huge factories, the alienation of city life, new kinds of disease spreading.
So his goal wasn't just academic curiosity. He wanted to understand them to maybe control them, balance them.
Precisely. Smirk genuinely hoped that by defining the categories, by understanding their domains, he could maybe prevent any single fear from just taking over everything. His taxonomy became the structure for understanding.
Yeah.
Even if, and this is important, it kind of became a limitation down the line.
Okay, so we definitely need to give you, the listener, a good map of this taxonomy. The whole world of the show really hangs on these specific flavors of fear. Let's run through Smirk's pantheon. Maybe group them by theme, starting with the ones about knowledge and control.
Good idea. These are maybe the most relevant to the Institute itself. First up, the eye, also called the beholding. This isn't just being watched like CCTV. It's the intense, consuming fear of being observed, scrutinized, known, recorded. It's also the compulsion to know, no matter the cost. The Magnus Institute is basically a temple built to feed that compulsion, right? Collecting stories, secrets, until the secrets eat them back.
It's that terror of having no private space left, your inner world totally exposed.
Spot on. And then you contrast that with the web, the spider. This one's all about manipulation. It's the fear that you were never actually in control, that every choice you thought you made freely, just a string being pulled by something unseen, that deep existential dread of being a puppet caught in someone else's grand hidden design.
Okay, moving on. What about fears related to scale? Isolation. These feel really fundamental, almost philosophical.
They really are. Deeply primal. So you've got the vast, sometimes called the falling titan or vertigo. This is that overwhelming fear of huge open spaces. The empty sky, the deep ocean, looking down from a massive height, just shrinks you down to nothing, confirms your total insignificance in this massive, uncaring universe.
And its conceptual opposite.
That has to be the buried. It's the complete flip side, the fear of being crushed, suffocated, confined, extreme claustrophobia, whether that's literally being trapped underground or, metaphorically buried by obligations, restrictions, lack of options. They really define each other through that opposition.
And slightly different, but still related to scale and connection, is the lonely.
Yeah, the lonely is about separation, emotional exile. It's the deep fear of being truly forgotten, of being deliberately left behind, or even the fear that your reality might just dissolve because there's no one left to witness it with you. Yeah. It really preys on alienation, social distance.
Right. Okay, next group. The really visceral ones. Body stuff, immediate danger. These feel ancient.
Oh, they are. Definitely primal. You have the flesh, which is maybe the most viscerally upsetting. It's the horror of meat, of being reduced to just component parts, consumable bits, body horror, cannibalism, losing yourself to just biological processes, the fear that ultimately you're just a sack of organs waiting to decay or be consumed.
Yeah, that's deeply unsettling.
And then the more active danger fears, the hunt. This is pure pursuit, the terror of being prey, knowing something relentless, stronger, faster is stalking you, and there's no escape, no reasoning with it. And alongside that, the slaughter. This is just raw violence, chaos, senseless rage, war for war's sake, bloodlust. That kind of ecstatic destruction that just throws reason out the window.
You can easily see how the slaughter would thrive during, major wars or periods of intense conflict.
Absolutely. It feeds on that breakdown of order. Okay, final group. These are the terrors that mess with your mind: perception, decay, madness, finality. So first, the corruption, or the rot. This isn't just about dying. It's the fear of infestation, disease, mold, filth, impurity, that creeping, sickening certainty that something unclean and alien is growing inside you or around you, just slowly consuming everything.
And the ones that warp reality itself.
That's the spiral, often called the distortion. This is like the ultimate mind plague. Madness, distorted perception, non-Euclidean geometry. It's the terror of realizing your fundamental understanding of reality was wrong all along. The very fabric of things warps, and its close cousin, the stranger. This is the fear of the uncanny. Masks, mannequins, replacements, imposters. That awful, creeping dread of the person standing next to you isn't really them. It's something else wearing their skin.
Chilling. Okay, and the last two. Representing the end, absence.
Right. The dark. Pretty straightforward, but powerful. The absolute absence of light, which means the absence of information, of safety, that primal fear of what you can't see lurking just beyond your senses. And finally, the end, terminus. This is the cold, hard certainty that everything, life, memory, consciousness, existence itself will just stop. It's terrifying, not because it's malicious, but because it's absolute, indifferent, final.
14 incredibly specific, yet somehow all-encompassing fears. That even Smirk's list, the structure he built, it wasn't quite enough for the modern world, was it? We see this 15th fear emerge, the extinction.
The extinction feels like a necessary update, doesn't it? For a modern horror cosmology, it's the fear of total annihilation, not just your death, like the end, but the erasure of the whole species, maybe the planet. It's tied directly to modern collective anxieties, things we created, potentially. Climate collapse, nuclear war, unstoppable pandemics.
It's the fear of a future without us, which feels different from the end's personal finality. Extinction is collective, systematic.
Exactly. Which means it inherently challenges that rigid 14-category structure Smirk set up. It emerged because human actions created these huge, new, systematic threats. Threats that didn't neatly fit into the more individual, primal terrors he'd outlined.
Which brings us perfectly to a really key insight from the sources. Smirk's own rigidity, his attachment to his list, was actually a major flaw. It held back understanding for a long time.
That's the core critique, yeah. Smirk got obsessed with his immutable, unchanging stone of the 14. He saw the fears too much like separate gods who didn't really mingle. He specifically worried that acknowledging lesser powers, things like the corruption or the flesh when they were maybe just starting out, would throw everything into confusion.
Yeah.
His need for neat boxes, for structure, kind of blinded him to how dynamic and fluid fear actually is.
So the categories are useful, maybe necessary, for our human brains to even start grappling with this stuff, but cosmologically speaking, they draw lines where maybe none really exist, which is why later characters in the show, they're looking for better ways to talk about it, right? Better metaphors.
Definitely. And probably the best conceptual tools we get come later, from people like Gerard Key and Jürgen Leitner. Key came up with the brilliant color wheel metaphor. He argued the entities aren't truly separate. They bleed into each other, like colors on a spectrum. Trying to categorize them into exactly 14 is a bit arbitrary, like trying to draw a sharp line between, say, indigo and lilac on a color wheel. They're both shades of purple, you know.
They're grouped for our convenience, but the underlying fear stuff is infinite, continuous.
Exactly. The 14 are maybe like primary, secondary, tertiary colors we've picked out from an infinite spectrum. The fears aren't colors, they are color itself. The labels are just a human attempt to make sense of something fundamentally beyond neat categorization.
And then Leitner gives us that really chilling ant analogy, which explains why humans are so keen on keeping the categories separate, even if they aren't really.
Right, Leitner's analogy is fantastic. He asks you to imagine an ant. If this ant sees a giant fingernail suddenly crush its colony, and then later it sees a massive unblinking eye watching it, and then later still a huge boot comes down and smashes its path, well, the ant would experience those as three completely separate, equally terrifying attackers.
Even though, from our perspective, they all come from the same single entity, the human.
Precisely. To the ant, the fingernail, the eye, the boot, they're distinct horrors. But to the human, they're just parts of one being acting in different ways. Leitner suggests our classification system, SMERX 14, does the same thing for us. It makes this overwhelming singular thing that was fear feel more manageable, more bite-sized. But we might be mistaking the different ways fear affects us for fundamentally different sources.
Okay, so if the fears bleed together, if the categories aren't absolute, that leads us naturally to this idea of motifs, these sort of secondary concepts or themes that seem to span multiple entities and act as really effective bait.
Motifs are such a critical tool for analysis here. They aren't entities themselves, but rather the fear of an idea or a situation that can activate multiple entities. Think of the entities as the paint, the raw color of dread. The motif is more like the painting itself, the specific scene or scenario that uses several of those colors. Or, as one source puts it, the motif is the plate on which the fear is served.
And the extinction, which we were just talking about, seems like a perfect example of a powerful motif rather than a whole new primary entity.
Absolutely. It's the ultimate modern motif, really. It clearly touches on end, cessation, the corruption, global sickness, radiation, the desolation, fire, destruction, maybe even the lonely being the last one left. People might not always consciously think, oh no, I fear the desolation right now, but they definitely fear the motif, like war or poverty or governmental collapse or climate change. The motif triggers the general fear, and then the specific terror that results, that's what feeds the corresponding entity or maybe multiple entities at once.
So if you're terrified of, say, a manipulative cult, that motif religious fanaticism maybe can feed different powers depending on how it plays out. If the cult uses secrecy and control, it feeds the web and the eye. If it ends in fiery destruction, it feeds the desolation. Mass suicide feeds the end.
Exactly. Or take a different scenario. Imagine being trapped alone in a huge, dark, abandoned aquarium at night. That single motif hits so many notes. It feeds the dark, no light, the lonely, isolation, the vast, the immense volume of water, the huge tanks, the buried trapped behind glass, maybe even the corruption, decaying exhibits, or the stranger, weird fish shapes in the gloom. The motif of creepy aquarium becomes the channel, the delivery mechanism for all these different specific fears. It helps explain why the statements the Institute collects often feel blurry, touching on multiple entities at once.
That idea of bleeding boundaries and blurred lines is maybe best explored by looking closely at two entities that seem to define each other by being total opposites, the vast and the buried.
Yes, this is one of the neatest conceptual pairings in the show. You have the vast, fear of openness, huge scale, philosophical insignificance, falling forever. And then the buried, the absolute opposite. Fear of confinement, crushing weight, restriction, suffocation, being trapped. They are pure conceptual foils in terms of scale and direction.
And they're so antithetical, so opposite, that the sources suggest they can't even really interact properly. When they clash, things get messy.
They seem to almost cancel each other out in a really unpleasant way. The sources give us the example of Jan Kilbride. He has this experience tied to the vast being on the Daedalus space station. Huge scale, immense drops. And then later, his remains are found dismembered and literally thrown into a pit linked to the buried, the ultimate crushing confinement. The way these forces collide in his fate seems brutal, chaotic, almost meaningless. It suggests they fundamentally disrupt each other.
I love that contrast because it quickly moves beyond just fear of heights versus fear of tight spaces. It gets into this really interesting thematic territory around like wealth and freedom.
Absolutely. This is where the entities start working as subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, societal critique. The vast often seems tied to money, privilege, and options. Think about it. Acrophobia, agoraphobia, these often manifest in contexts that require some wealth. Mountaineering, living in penthouses, affording large open-plan homes, even space travel.
Right. You need a certain amount of freedom and resource to even encounter those kinds of terrifying scales.
Exactly, and the avatars of the vast we meet, like Simon Fairchild, he's defined by his immense wealth. He uses his fortune to create opportunities for vast-related fear, funding massive, ambitious projects like that Daedalus space station, investigating weird sites like Hilltop Road. He's literally spending money to generate fear of scale.
And the buried, naturally, is the flip side. The fear of having your options crushed, restricted.
The buried provides a stark contrast. Its victims, and the few avatars it has, generally lack that kind of access, that mobility. The fear of being trapped, physically or metaphorically, often mirrors economic helplessness, social immobility, a lack of choices. So the difference in how these two entities manifest really shows how fear isn't just some abstract psychological thing. It's deeply tangled up in systems of power, class, and money.
In the vast, the falling titan, it also holds sway over domains beyond just heights, right? Which reinforces its sheer scope.
Oh yeah, it's got a broad reach,
Right.
open water, the deep ocean that's vast territory, the terrifying expanse of space. It manifests in encounters with impossibly large creatures, overwhelming natural forces, and that deep philosophical dread of just being utterly meaningless against the sheer scale of existence. It's constantly reminding you that no matter how neat and tidy we try to make our human world, the universe itself is vast, indifferent, and ultimately doesn't care about us at all.
Which brings us, I think, to the deepest layer of analysis for the show. How TMA takes that traditional cosmic horror, which usually actively avoids everyday human concerns, and turns it inward. How it uses these entities as a really sophisticated lens for social and psychological critique.
Yeah, this is where TMA really diverges from, say, Lovecraft. Traditional cosmic horror often explicitly dismisses mundane anxieties, hopes, or beliefs as being too small-scale for true existential dread. TMA argues the opposite. It says the entities are those anxieties crystallized. They function as these phobic pressure points, engaging directly with politics, economics, psychology. The horror isn't that the entities are totally alien. The horror is that they're reflections of the very systems and traumas we live with every day.
Okay, let's take an example. The Desolation. Fear, fire, pain, loss, destruction. It's not just random arson. It's linked specifically to capital, to economic systems.
That link is really strong. The Desolation often connects to the fear of economic ruin. Some of its key avatars, there were stockbrokers, landlords, people who gained power through financial manipulation. And the destruction it brings, burning things down, often mirrors the destruction of someone's livelihood, their security. Think about Jack Barnabas. He loses his job, his ability to function in society, partly because the visible mark of the desolation, his burnt face, makes him unemployable in his old life. The fear of losing everything you've built, of economic precarity, that's a powerful fuel for this cosmic terror.
And The Lonely provides a similar, really fascinating critique, but focused more on class structure and isolation within society.
The Lonely is great because it shows how isolation works differently at different levels of society. You have a wealthy Lucas family. They use their vast resources, huge remote mansions, private boats, to choose isolation, to escape responsibility, connection. But that's contrasted sharply with a kind of loneliness experienced by people in crowded, often lower-class conditions, feeling alone in a crowd. Martin Blackwood's arc kind of embodies that latter struggle. He isolates himself within the Institute, seeking power and knowledge, but finds this crushing emptiness in that self-imposed exile. So the fear of being alone gets reframed. It's not just a personal failing. It's shown as a reflection of these broader systemic disconnects in society.
So when the show grounds the cosmic horror in these, well, sometimes mundane anxieties, the whole philosophical fight shifts, doesn't it? It stops being just, how do we kill the monster? And becomes much more about existentialism, questions of agency, choice, responsibility. Jean-Paul Sartre's ideas about bad faith seem really relevant here.
That's spot on. The show implicitly and sometimes explicitly argues that the real price of surrendering to a fear entity isn't just, becoming a monster. It's the complete loss of agency. You become what Sartre might call an existential object, a thing defined entirely by its function, without the capacity for true, authentic choice. You lose your essential humanity.
And we see that difference play out really clearly when we compare characters like Helen Richardson and Mike Crew.
Right. Helen Richardson, who gets taken by the spiral, the distortion, she wasn't really an avatar who chose it. She was a victim, assimilated, transformed. She becomes a monster, unable to choose authentically. When John confronts her, he notes she doesn't even seem to have a motive anymore. She just is the distortion. It's just what you are, he says. She's become that existential object, fully defined by the fear.
But contrast that with Mike Crew, the vast avatar. He chose to join, didn't he?
He did choose, yes. He devoted himself to the vast as a way to escape a tormentor, someone tied to the spiral, ironically. And he justifies his final leap, embracing the vast, by saying he had no reason not to. But from an existentialist viewpoint, that's arguably bad faith. Sartre would argue that even facing overwhelming terror, even with a gun to your head, you always retain a sliver of choice, however awful the options. By denying any alternative, by claiming necessity forced his hand, Mike essentially chose to become an object of circumstance. He surrendered his freedom as his choice. The horror is choosing to give up your agency.
That focus on authentic choice, on fighting against becoming an object, makes the resistance we see from some characters incredibly powerful. The struggle for choice becomes the core moral battle.
And it leads directly into that big debate about free will itself. You have Annabelle Kane, the incredibly manipulative web avatar, arguing for pure determinism. She basically says, free will is just an illusion born of ignorance. If you knew every single factor influencing a decision, genetics, upbringing, environment, everything, the outcome would be totally predictable. She dismisses free will as just the name we give to the fact that no one can ever really see everything that controls them. Very bleak, very web.
It's a dark viewpoint, very compelling, especially coming from her. But the narrative seems to validate the other side, too, the power of consciously, deliberately asserting your own will, even when it seems futile.
Absolutely. And the prime example of that counterargument is Melanie King. When she finds out she's essentially bound to the Institute, bound to the eye, she doesn't just accept it, she actively resists. She declares, I'm not turning, I'm jammed. She refuses to comply. And later, when she learns the only way to truly sever her connection to the eye, which gives her unwanted knowledge but strips her of autonomy, is to blind herself.
She does it. That's such an extreme, brutal choice.
It's the ultimate assertion of bodily autonomy, of authentic choice against an overwhelming force. She chooses immense pain and loss, but chooses it herself, rather than passively accepting a fate pushed onto her. And importantly, the narrative frames this as a valid, even healthy decision. And she survives the apocalypse. Her survival really suggests that this fierce assertion of self-defined choice is maybe the key to resisting the entity's ultimate consumption.
And this whole framework, this focus on choice and responsibility, it completely recontextualizes Jonathan Sims' entire journey, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. His supposed fatal flaw, his curiosity, his skepticism, his relentless need to know, we learn that was potentially engineered, manipulated by the web since he was a child.
Right. His intense guilt throughout the series, his agony over becoming a monster, his feeling of responsibility for the changed world, it's all tied up in this question of choice. The narrative suggests his path wasn't just predetermined by some inherent flaw. He was pushed, manipulated. Which means, crucially, he still has the capacity to choose differently, to change his moral stance, his commitment, and his final pivotal decision in the series. It revolves entirely around choosing connection, choosing the life of someone he loves over his own pre-planned sacrifice. It shows choice remains, even at the very end.
Okay, so let's pull back for the conclusion. After digging through Smirk's flawed system, the metaphors like the color wheel and the ant, the case studies like Vast and Buried, this deep dive into agency and existentialism, what really stands out is the core defining horror of the Magnus Archives.
I think it's the synthesis. It's not really about fighting 14 separate monsters anymore. The true horror is the interconnectedness, the web of fear, you could say. It's seeing how the fears form this cycle, this ecosystem, where every terror feeds and supports another. And the entities are terrifying, not because they're completely alien and unknowable, but because they are so deeply uncomfortably human. They're like distorted reflections of our own traumas or societal anxieties, the very systems we build around ourselves.
And then there's that final devastating move the show makes, breaking the fourth wall, implicating us, the listeners.
That's the final turn of the screw, isn't it? The show spends years building this distance. You're listening to recordings of things that happen to other people. And then it reveals that the act of recording and archiving these statements, the very tapes we have been listening to, was itself part of a massive ritual. A ritual orchestrated by the web. A ritual designed to transmit the fears, to send them out into other realities, potentially our reality, as a way to save them from dying in their own universe. So by listening, By consuming the horror week after week, we weren't just observers, we became participants. Complicit in its horror, as the source puts it.
That is just a masterful, chilling way to end a horror narrative, making the audience part of the mechanism. And finally, the series leaves us hanging, doesn't it? No neat bow. The ultimate fate of the main characters is left ambiguous.
We get that final, heartbreaking tape from Basira. Just uncertainty. If anyone's listening, goodbye, I'm sorry, and good luck. That ambiguity really hammers home the existential themes. If, as the show seems to suggest, real authenticity, real selfhood, comes from constantly choosing who you are moment by moment, then maybe the ultimate tragedy for John, the protagonist, wasn't just everything that happened to him. Maybe it was his struggle right at the end to fully forgive himself, to accept his own choices and move forward.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a question that echoes long after the static fades. It pushes past the fiction. What fears do you hold on to? Not the big cosmic ones necessarily, but the smaller ones, the ones that shape your life. Which ones do you cling to, maybe not because they actually protect you, but because over time, they've become part of how you define yourself? That feels like the real lingering dread the archives leaves behind.
Echoes of the past, visions of tomorrow.